In the autumn of the year 1347, a Mediterranean port city woke as it always had. Morning light spilled across stone streets, polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. Bakers opened their shutters, fishermen unloaded their catch. Church bells marked the rhythm of the day, steady and reassuring. Merchants spoke of shipments from the east, of silk, grain and spices that would soon change hands. Children ran across the square while adults debated prices and rumours. Everything looked ordinary. Everything felt permanent. No one suspected that this calm morning belonged to the final chapter of an old world. Then the ships arrived. They came from the eastern trade routes, their sails weathered, their hulls heavy with cargo. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Trade had always carried stories of hardship and disease. But as dock workers climbed aboard, they found sailors collapsed on the decks. Some were dead, others burned with fever, barely conscious. Dark swellings rose beneath their arms and along their necks, painful and unnatural. No one knew how to name what they were seeing. Chroniclers in Sicily would later record that in the late months of 1347, after the arrival of these vessels at Messina, death spread faster than fear could keep pace. Within days, the city began to change. Homes shut their doors, markets emptied. The soundscape of daily life thinned until it was broken only by bells tolling for the dead. Physicians trained in the ancient teachings of humours and corrupted air searched for causes in the sky, in the winds, in the alignment of planets. Priests led prayers and processions. Fires burned aromatic woods to cleanse the streets. None of it slowed what was coming. Medicine, as it existed then, could not see the enemy, let alone stop it. By the turning of the year into 1348, the realization spread that this was not an isolated calamity. The disease moved with terrifying logic, following sea lanes and caravan roads, leaping from port to port, city to city. It reached the great urban centres of Europe, places crowded beyond their ancient walls, places built for trade and growth rather than survival against unseen threats. Entire neighbourhoods fell silent. Families vanished within days. The structures that held society together, law, labour, faith, began to fracture under the weight of constant loss. By the early years of the 1350s, the first catastrophic wave began to subside in many regions. Not because humanity had prevailed, but because the disease had exhausted the most vulnerable paths before it. Between the years 1347 and 1351, Europe had been irreversibly altered. Later generations would name this catastrophe the Black Death, but those who lived through it had no such clarity. They only knew absence, silence, and the lingering question of why. What force could erase millions of lives in so short a span of time? Was it divine punishment, a twist of fate, or the hidden cost of a connected and flourishing world? And how did these years of suffering reshape society, labour, belief, and medicine itself? To answer these questions, we must turn back further still, to the origins of a disease born far from Europe, long before the first ship reached its harbour, and long before anyone understood that the foundations of the modern world were being laid in the shadow of death. Long before the streets of Europe fell silent, the story of the Black Death began far from any cathedral or marketplace. Its origins lie deep in Central Asia, in the vast grasslands stretching across regions that today include parts of modern Kyrgyzstan and northern China. For centuries, this landscape had been home to burrowing rodents such as marmots and ground squirrels. Within their populations lived a bacterium that rarely disturbed human history, known today as Yersinia pestis. In this environment, disease and host existed in a fragile but stable balance. During the late 1320s and early 1330s, this balance began to break. Climate records, reconstructed by modern historians, suggest a period of ecological stress. Cycles of drought followed by sudden heavy rains altered vegetation across the steppes. Rodent food supplies collapsed. As populations declined, fleas carrying the bacterium searched for new hosts. In these years, humans were no longer distant observers of the disease cycle. They had moved closer, establishing permanent trade outposts, military camps, and caravan stations across the region. This shift was not accidental. By the early 13th century, much of Eurasia had been drawn into a single interconnected system under the rule of the Mongol Empire. By the 1330s, this system had matured into what historians later called the Pax Mongolica. Roads were secured, merchants travelled farther and faster than ever before, goods, ideas, and people moved across continents with unprecedented efficiency. Along with them travelled pathogens that had once been confined to isolated ecosystems. The first human outbreaks likely occurred among traders, soldiers, and camp followers operating along the Silk Road routes during the early 1330s. At this stage, the disease did not yet threaten civilization on a continental scale. Outbreaks flared and faded in remote settlements. Death was brutal but localized. Without an understanding of contagion, these early victims left few written traces, their suffering absorbed into the background noise of medieval life. By the middle of the 1340s, however, conditions aligned in a way history rarely witnesses. Trade intensified, armies mobilized, urban populations grew denser. The bacterium found not just new hosts, but a new world built to carry it forward. The disease travelled westward, not as an invading army, but as a passenger hidden within the mechanisms of prosperity. By the time it reached the edges of the Black Sea in the mid-1340s, the foundations of disaster were already set. No dramatic announcement marked its arrival. No single moment signaled the beginning of catastrophe. The Black Death entered human history quietly, carried by fleas, rats, and the invisible momentum of a connected world. When it finally revealed itself to Europe, it would appear sudden and apocalyptic. In truth, it had been gathering strength for decades, waiting for the moment when human civilization itself would open the door. By the middle of the 1340s, the disease that had smouldered along the trade routes of Asia reached a critical threshold. It was no longer confined to scattered outbreaks among caravans and frontier settlements. In the year 1346, the Black Death arrived at the crossroads between continents, where land routes met the sea and commerce converged into fortified cities. One of these cities stood on the Crimean Peninsula overlooking the Black Sea. It was known as Kaffa, a wealthy and heavily defended trading hub controlled by the Republic of Genoa. Here, Asian goods were transferred from overland caravans onto ships bound for the Mediterranean. In the year 1346, Kaffa became the stage for an event that would alter the course of global history. That year, the city was under siege by the army of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Jani Beg. The siege followed the familiar patterns of medieval warfare. Supplies were cut. Defenders waited behind stone walls. The attackers lived in crowded camps beyond them. It was there, among soldiers and pack animals, that the disease struck with devastating force. Men began to fall ill in alarming numbers. Fevers raged. Bodies darkened and decayed before death. The Mongol army did not collapse under enemy weapons, but under the weight of biology. Faced with a failing siege and a dying army, Jani Beg made a decision born of desperation. Chroniclers later recorded that plague-ridden corpses were hurled over the walls of Kaffa, using siege engines designed for stone and fire. Whether intended as a calculated act or a final gesture of fury, the result was the same. The disease entered the city. Fleas abandoned dead hosts and found new ones among the living. The fortress, impregnable to armies, could not defend against infection. By the late months of 1346 and into 1347, panic gripped Kaffa. Merchants understood that the city could not be saved. Genoese ships were prepared in haste. Families, cargo, and crew were loaded together, sharing cramped quarters with rats and fleas hidden among grain and fabric. When the ships slipped into the Black Sea, they carried more than refugees. They carried the Black Death into the heart of Europe. In the autumn of 1347, these vessels reached Mediterranean ports. Sicily was among the first to record the catastrophe. In Messina, observers described ships filled with corpses and dying men. Authorities ordered the vessels expelled, but the disease had already escaped. Rats ran along mooring lines. Fleas found new hosts. Within weeks, the city was overwhelmed. From there, the spread followed the logic of trade rather than the borders of kingdoms. During the year 1348, the disease moved westward to Genoa and Venice, northward into France, and inland along rivers and roads that had once symbolized prosperity. Each port became a new ignition point. Each city repeated the same pattern of disbelief, fear, and collapse. Human responses varied, but none proved effective. Some cities attempted isolation, others blamed foreign merchants or divine wrath. Processions gathered crowds in prayer, unknowingly accelerating transmission. The very networks that had brought wealth and stability now acted as conduits for disaster. By the end of 1348, the Black Death was no longer a distant threat or a rumor from the coast. It was an unstoppable force embedded within the daily movement of people and goods. Europe was connected too well, and too late did it realize that connection itself had become the disease's greatest ally. By the year 1348, the question was no longer whether the disease would reach a community, but how completely it would dismantle it. In city after city, mortality arrived in waves so fast that the living could not keep pace with the dead. Contemporary witnesses struggled to comprehend the scale. They did not speak in statistics. They spoke of absence, of houses where no smoke rose, of streets where no footsteps echoed. Modern historians estimate that between the late 1340s and the early 1350s, roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population perished. In some regions, the losses were far greater. In the Italian city of Florence, chroniclers described entire neighborhoods emptied within months. In Paris, burial grounds overflowed, forcing the dead into mass graves beyond the city walls. In London, carts moved through the streets at dawn, collecting bodies from doorways before the heat of the day set in. The impact on families was immediate and devastating. Parents buried children. Children were left orphaned overnight. In many households, there was no one left alive to remember the names of the dead. Social bonds that had defined medieval life fractured under the fear of contagion. The sick were avoided, the dying were left alone. Acts of care became acts of risk. Economic life collapsed alongside human life. Workshops stood idle. Markets failed to open. Fields went unharvested as labourers died or fled. By the year 1349, shortages spread even where food remained plentiful because there were too few hands to transport or distribute it. Inflation surged. Wages, once tightly controlled by custom and law, began to rise as surviving workers discovered their labour was suddenly scarce. The countryside suffered more quietly, but no less profoundly. Thousands of villages disappeared entirely, their names lost to history. Manorial estates that had relied on generations of peasant labour fell into neglect. Livestock wandered untended. Forests reclaimed farmland. Wolves and other predators moved closer to human settlements, drawn by the sudden absence of people. Psychologically, the damage ran deeper still. The constant presence of death altered how time itself was experienced. The future no longer extended years ahead. It narrowed to days, sometimes to hours. Religious certainty wavered as prayers went unanswered and clergy died at the same rate as their congregations. Trust in institutions eroded, not through rebellion, but through sheer exhaustion. By the early 1350s, as the first great wave of the plague began to recede, survivors found themselves standing in a world that looked familiar but felt fundamentally altered. The physical landscape remained. The churches, roads, and walls still stood. But the human fabric that gave them meaning had been torn apart. What remained was a society forced to rebuild itself, not by choice, but by necessity, carrying forward the memory of loss into every decision that followed. As the plague tightened its grip between the years 1348 and 1351, people did not face it with ignorance or indifference. They faced it with the best knowledge their world possessed. Medieval medicine was not random superstition. It was a coherent system built on centuries of inherited learning, grounded in the teachings of ancient authorities and refined through observation and tradition. The tragedy was not that people failed to act, but that everything they believed about illness led them in the wrong direction. Physicians across Europe understood disease through the balance of humours within the body and the quality of the air surrounding it. When the plague struck, many concluded that the atmosphere itself had become corrupted. In the year 1345, a rare alignment of planets was cited by scholars as a possible cause, releasing poisonous vapours from the Earth. Medical faculties, such as those at the University of Paris, advised avoiding foul smells, closing windows, and burning aromatic woods to purify the air. Streets filled with smoke from juniper, rosemary, and incense as people tried to cleanse an enemy they believed was carried by the wind. Treatment focused on restoring balance rather than eliminating a pathogen no one could see. Bloodletting was widely practiced, even as patients weakened rapidly. Buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that marked the disease, were lanced in hopes of releasing corrupted humours. Instead, these procedures often accelerated death by spreading infection through the bloodstream. Bathing was discouraged, as it was thought to open the pores and allow poisoned air to enter the body. The very acts meant to preserve life frequently hastened its end. Alongside medicine stood faith. In a world where the spiritual and physical were inseparable, the plague was widely understood as divine judgment. Churches filled with worshippers seeking mercy, processions wound through city streets, gathering crowds whose closeness unknowingly aided the spread of disease. Some believers turned inward, convinced that repentance alone could halt the catastrophe. Movements of public penance emerged, most notably the flagellants, who marched from town to town, whipping their own bodies in ritual displays of suffering, hoping to absorb the sins of humanity and appease divine wrath. Others searched for human explanations. Fear demanded a cause that could be seen and punished. In several regions, rumours spread that minority communities were responsible for poisoning wells or invoking dark forces. Despite efforts by figures such as Pope Clement VI to condemn these accusations and offer protection, violence erupted. Entire communities were destroyed, not by disease, but by fear given direction. Amid this chaos, there were acts of quiet courage. Physicians continued to treat the sick despite knowing the risk. Clergy remained with the dying when families fled. Caregivers, gravediggers, and servants performed essential work at enormous personal cost. Many of them did not survive, but their efforts prevented total collapse. The failure of treatment was not a failure of humanity. It was the limit of knowledge at a particular moment in history. People acted rationally within the framework they had inherited. The plague exposed the boundaries of that framework, revealing how little was truly understood about the hidden forces shaping life and death. In doing so, it planted the first seeds of doubt that would, centuries later, transform medicine itself. By the early years of the 1350s, something subtle but profound began to shift. The plague did not vanish, but its relentless advance slowed. Communities that had been devastated in earlier years experienced fewer new cases. Survivors, cautious and altered by loss, began to notice patterns, even if they could not yet explain them. This was not understanding in the modern sense. It was recognition born from repetition. In cities such as Venice, officials observed that disease often arrived by ship before it appeared on land. By the middle of the 14th century, Venetian authorities began experimenting with isolation. Incoming vessels were held offshore for extended periods, their crews and cargo separated from the city. The duration was not arbitrary. 40 days, a period drawn from biblical symbolism and empirical observation, became the standard. From this practice came the concept of quarantine, a word rooted in the Italian term quaranta giorni. It did not cure the sick, but it slowed the spread, marking one of the earliest public health measures in European history. Elsewhere, similar realizations emerged independently. Cities closed gates. Travel was restricted. Markets were reorganized or suspended. These measures were inconsistent and often resisted, but they represented a turning point. For the first time, disease was treated not only as a personal affliction or divine message, but as a collective threat requiring coordinated response. At the same time, the plague itself began to change. The most virulent outbreaks burned through dense populations quickly, then faded as susceptible hosts diminished. Survivors may have carried partial immunity, though this would not be understood for centuries. The disease retreated not because it was defeated, but because the conditions that had fueled its first wave no longer existed in the same form. Intellectually, the catastrophe left deep scars. Scholars and physicians were forced to confront the failure of inherited authorities. Ancient texts had offered no protection. Astrology had not provided answers. While no immediate scientific revolution followed, a quiet skepticism took root. Observation began to matter more than tradition. Experience began to challenge doctrine. By the latter half of the 14th century, Europe entered a new rhythm of life, shaped by expectation of recurrence. The plague would return again and again in cycles that lasted for centuries. But it would never again arrive in the same way. Communities remembered, institutions adapted, fear remained, but it was no longer blind. The turning point of the Black Death was not a moment of victory, it was a moment of adjustment. Humanity did not conquer the disease. It learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to live in its shadow. In that adaptation lay the earliest foundations of modern public health, born not from triumph, but from survival. By the early 1350s, the first great wave of the Black Death began to loosen its grip on Europe. In many regions, the summer brought fewer new cases. Church bells rang less often. Burial pits stopped expanding. There was no proclamation of victory, no moment when people could say the danger had passed. The plague did not retreat with drama. It receded quietly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the noise of death. Between the years 1347 and 1351, the disease had swept across nearly the entire continent. By the time it slowed, vast stretches of Europe had been emptied of people. Cities stood intact but hollow. Villages had vanished altogether. Fields lay fallow, not because the land had failed, but because the hands that worked it were gone. The plague had not merely killed individuals. It had erased patterns of life that had endured for centuries. For those who survived, the end of the first wave was not a return to normal, but an awakening into a different world. Daily routines resumed cautiously. Trade restarted in fragments. Governments attempted to reassert control. often through laws designed to freeze wages and restore pre-plague hierarchies. Yet these efforts struggled against a new reality. Labour was scarce. Survivors had choices their ancestors never possessed. Crucially, the disease did not disappear. After 1351, the Black Death settled into a grim cycle of recurrence. It returned to Europe repeatedly over the following centuries, striking cities and regions at irregular intervals. Each outbreak was feared, but none matched the scale or shock of the first. The initial catastrophe had been unique, not because the disease was different, but because humanity had been unprepared. The end of the first pandemic wave marked a boundary in history. Everything before it belonged to a medieval world defined by steady growth and inherited certainty. Everything after it unfolded under the shadow of fragility. People had learned that systems could fail, that faith and knowledge had limits, and that survival often depended on adaptation rather than control. The Black Death did not end in triumph or understanding. It ended in exhaustion. It left behind a continent that had been forced to confront its own vulnerability. In doing so, it closed one chapter of human history and opened another, one shaped by memory, caution, and the slow, painful effort to rebuild meaning after unimaginable loss. When the world began to move again, it did so cautiously, as if unsure whether the ground beneath it could still be trusted. The decades after the Black Death did not feel like recovery. They felt like aftermath. Europe's cities were rebuilt with familiar stone and timber, but the assumptions that had once governed life were gone. Population never returned to its former density for generations. Entire family lines had ended. Traditions vanished simply because no one remained to remember them. The world looked the same, yet it no longer believed in its own permanence. Out of this rupture emerged profound change. The loss of nearly half the population altered the balance between labour and power. Survivors discovered that their work was suddenly valuable. Wages rose. Mobility increased. In many regions, the rigid structures of serfdom weakened or collapsed altogether. Authority, once rooted in immovable hierarchy, had to negotiate with a population that understood its own worth. The Black Death did not create a fair society, but it cracked systems that had seemed eternal. Medicine, too, was quietly transformed. The failure of ancient knowledge left a lasting scar on intellectual life. While no immediate scientific revolution followed, trust in inherited authority eroded. Observation and experience gained new importance. Over centuries, this shift would contribute to the foundations of epidemiology, public health, and eventually germ theory. Practices such as quarantine, first tested in desperation, became institutional tools. Cities began to imagine health not as a private matter, but as a collective responsibility. Culturally, death never left the imagination. Art and literature of the late medieval period reflected a world haunted by memory. The motif, known as the danse macabre, appeared across Europe, depicting kings, priests, and peasants led together by skeletal figures. It was not meant to terrify. It was meant to remind. Death had proven itself the great equalizer, indifferent to wealth, power, or virtue. The Church emerged changed as well. Its moral authority had been shaken by unanswered prayers and mass mortality among clergy. Faith did not disappear, but it became more personal, more fractured. Doubt, once dangerous, became part of the human conversation. In this uncertainty lay the seeds of future reform. From a distance of centuries, the Black Death appears not only as a catastrophe, but as a turning point. It forced humanity to confront the limits of control, knowledge, and belief. It revealed how deeply civilization depends on invisible systems and how quickly those systems can fail. Today, the streets are crowded again. Trade moves faster than ever. Science sees what medieval eyes could not. Yet the questions raised in the years between 1347 and 1351 remain familiar. How fragile is the world we have built? How prepared are we for forces beyond our understanding? The Black Death was not only a disease, it was a test of civilization. And history reminds us that such tests do not belong to the past alone.